Let's talk closing costs when you're getting ready to sell your property. When you are getting ready to sell your property, the most important thing you can do before you even stick it on the market and you just have a thought about thinking it is you need to reach out to your agent and say, can you give me a net sheet? What is the equity in my property? There are a lot of things that affect what you're going to net on the sale of the property. The first one is how long have you owned the property? If you haven't owned the property for at least 2 years, you're going to net probably very little on the sale of that property, especially if you have a mortgage to still pay off. So I always recommend to people try to own the property for at least 2 years, because if you don't own it for at least 2 years, you're going to have capital gains taxes to pay off on top of that. And if you can hold on to the property for at least 5 years, you'll have a lot more equity in that property. Park City appreciates at about 7.1% per year annually. Heber Midway might be slightly lower, maybe somewhere in the sixes. But those are all things factor into what you're actually going to net on the sale of your property. So you want to see the net sheet because you want to see all the little hidden fees that go into there. There's a tax proration. Depending on when that property closes, the taxes will be prorated, what you're going to have to owe versus what the buyer's going to owe. And that's going to change depending on when that property sells. So that is really just an estimate. But the big fees are really the brokerage fees, the title company fees, and if you have a large mortgage payment to still pay off. I had a client that recently reached out to me. They were thinking about moving into a bigger place. I gave them 3 net sheets because they haven't owned the property for a year yet. And I've been telling them, I think try to stay in it at least one more year if you can, because you're not going to net very much on the sale of this property. I gave them the 3 net sheets and they were like, wow. I think the closing costs were a lot higher than they expected. So they're like, I think we will take your advice. So really understanding what you're going to net when you sell that property. I have a similar situation with a seller down in Midway. They moved to Midway. They didn't really like Midway for whatever reason. I'm not sure. They're like the only people on planet Earth that did not like Midway. So they wanted to move back to Park City and they were going to rent in Park City. They hadn't owned the property for a year yet. So let's say that the appreciation in Midway was like 6.5% at the time. They put about $80,000 worth of upgrades into this property. So we took what they bought it for, which was like $1.425 million. They haven't owned the property for a year yet. So then we added on 6.5% appreciation to that number plus the $80,000. And that got us to right around like $1.694 million. That was going to be the list price. Well, I'll tell you what, that pricing strategy worked because these guys got multiple offers and their home actually ended up selling for $1.9 million to a cash buyer. Really understanding that if you overprice your property, you're going to sit. At the end of the day, your pricing strategy really matters. Where are you going to go next? Why do you need to sell? And sometimes the pain of staying where you are might be greater than just taking the lower net so that you can get into a bigger place. That is something you have to figure out as a seller. Your closing costs really come down to how long you've owned the property. The longer that you've owned the property, the more equity you're going to have in this property, and you'll have less of a loan because you'll be paying it off each year. The loan's going to get lower and lower and lower. So you're going to be able to net more when you go to sell that property. Now, if you're cash, it might not matter. And you don't have a mortgage to pay off, you will probably net quite a bit more. That is sort of a breakdown of closing costs. So I always recommend when you're thinking about selling your property, always ask for a net sheet so you have an idea about your equity before you put your house on the market. And you're shocked when you get an offer and then you realize, you go to the closing table and you realize you're actually not going to net that much because you didn't do the research ahead of time. You didn't realize, oh my gosh, we have $1 million mortgage loan payoff on top of brokerage fees and title fees. And the buyer asked us for this credit because it found radon in the property, whatever it is, right? You don't know what you don't know. When you're thinking about selling your house, always ask for a net sheet. And you want to know the comparables in the neighborhood, what's selling, what's sitting, what is pending, what has closed. Price per square foot. What did the interior look like? What kind of floor plan was it? Was it similar to yours? Did they have updates in the property? What did the furniture look like? What did the pictures look like? Did they have a nice listing video? All of these things play into kind of the presentation of the property. And all of that stuff really matters when you go to sell your house. Again, the longer that you own that property, the more equity you're going to have in your property. And I always like to also tell buyers, like, don't buy in the Wasatch back. unless you're planning on owning that property for at least 5 years. And I mean, minimum would be 2. 2 years, you'll be able to have some flexibility. If you haven't even owned it for a year yet, you've got a large mortgage to pay off, the payoff for you might not be that great. So you kind of have to decide, do we want to take a smaller net and get into a bigger house because we want to be more comfortable? Or can we handle living in the property that we're still in and wait a few years so that we can net more? That's just a decision that you will have to talk about on your own. Hey, my name is Nicole Bowdle. I'm a luxury agent in the Park City area. If you're thinking about selling your house, make sure that you check out my free home estimate. All you have to do is type in your address and you'll get an instant breakdown of what your home is worth and your closing costs and the equity in your property. I can also provide you with a net sheet if you're thinking about selling your property or you just want to know what you think your property could sell for.